Actually, I come here with three perspectives. My day job is a director at Altair International, which is a global housing advisory firm. I also come here, and also a sponsor, thanks for reminding me. And also I'm a developer or investor in an green affordable housing company in Nigeria, which we just started. And I also come with, I think, over 12 years of real estate or housing experience in the United Kingdom. And it's sort of, if you can move on to the next slide, please. To some extent, the next one. And to the extent that's what I bring to this subject, which is just taking a step back, recognizing that there's a lot of interest in Africa around investment, at least green investment. No doubt, some of them initiated by institutions like the World Bank and many, the Green Growth Institute. So there's a lot of money being discussed or being implemented towards the idea of green housing in Africa. And for me, it was an opportunity to take a step back to say, what are the lessons we need to learn in the past where a lot of initiatives have been driven by money, and later down the line, the pipeline has not been there to deliver that capital investment. And I think the green agenda potentially is one of those where we're going into it, but from an initiative-driven agenda. So whether it's let's focus on certification, let's focus on materials, but without taking a step back and say, look, the markets where green housing is being developed successfully globally, actually, what are the enabling factors? How have they been created, and what are the lessons we need to learn so that we can fast track that implementation across Africa and not repeat the same mistakes some of those countries have made. So that's the primary purpose. Next slide, please. But in order to do that, it's always important to start with defining what you mean by green housing markets. And because again, this is some of the terminology that we use interchangeably, and everybody's got its own definition. For the context of the research we commissioned, we defined them as markets that encompasses specific geographical areas. So they may be cities, they may be countries, they may be municipal authorities, but critically, it focuses on real estate development, it prioritizes sustainability, it's looking at affordability, and also incorporating eco-friendly construction activities. But crucially, and I think this is a common point, it is central to all this is the role of the customers or the user. And that's the way we've defined in this context. And I'm sure people will have their own other definitions. Next slide, please. And by the same token, we decided that what do we mean by a green home? And in this case, we're talking about, and some of it consistently, if you've listened to all the sessions from yesterday and today, again, that definition of green home has been used interchangeably. For the context of this research, we were emphasizing the use of sustainable materials, reduced energy consumption, lower carbon footprints, and critically, enhanced living environment for the occupant. So you see, consistent in terms of the definition we use is coming back to the user. So not what we as so-called experts or we as practitioners want. Ultimately, the people that will decide whether green functions is people living in those homes. Next slide, please. So I think I've mentioned why we embarked upon this particular research, but I think the point needs to be made again around the fact that it's potentially easier to make a case for the finance, but it's much more challenging actually to translate that finance into deliverables. And I think when we talk about some of our experiences around institutions that have been created to either refinance or institutions we created to provide one form of finance, and now we're coming back having a conversation that, oh, we forgot to tackle supply. The finance is there, but the supply is not there. The question I think we never ask ourselves in the first instance that, why didn't we think about both demand and supply in the first instance? That question never gets asked, and I think this is an opportunity to start afresh. Next slide, please. So this research, we combined a qualitative and quantitative approach. We went to review all literature, or significant literature available in terms of enabling factors for green housing market. We looked at various case studies, some of them we've mentioned here. We did some stakeholders interview, and I'm glad Jen is here from the European Mortgage Federation, because she was one of the people we interviewed. Had a lot of conversations with IFC colleagues globally, spoke to colleagues from green building councils globally, from Chile down to Africa, Nigeria, and a range of, in all, we spoke to about 30 stakeholders, or so-called experts on green housing and green investment, just to check whether what our findings were relevant. And subsequently, we've, I think, come out with a toolkit, which I will mention to you later. And we're now in the process of commencing a pilot study with the IFC on a couple of countries in Africa to test the toolkit. Next slide, please. What are the key findings? Some of them, I think, have been mentioned throughout the conference. Successful markets have government support. The successful markets, in terms of the research we did, have regulatory environments that work. They set standards, they enforce those standards. And I think one of the examples I always use, and this is not calling out any particular country, but I will use, I think it's safer because my background is Nigeria. I use Nigeria as the example. The number of times you read stories of buildings collapsing because building standards are not being enforced, or building standards are not being, and by the way, we're not talking about the lower income houses. We're talking about some of the most prestigious, high value properties that are collapsing. So the question there for me is that if we cannot fix regular building enforcement standards, and then somebody introduces green certification, green standards, if those institutions that undertake the enforcement do not have the capacity to do that, how do you think green standard certification will fly? Especially when a lot of banks and investors are relying on those standards as a way of justifying their investment. And so that's just a little example about actually, at times, the enabling institutions to make the green agenda work we need to make sure that we carefully assess their capability and carefully assess how well they're functioning. And so, but what we see in successful markets is that those institutions are working. And so you can't have a successful green housing market without institutions that are functioning well. Colleagues have talked about it. Data is very important, critical, and we picked that up in a lot of our findings. Then the other thing that was actually interesting is also in some of the successful markets, there is a user culture that has embraced green. And I think we underestimate it in this room when we don't recognize the fact that out there, most people are more concerned about, I just want shelter. Give me affordable shelter. So if you're then coming to start talking about green, and in some cases, the green that is expensive, they will laugh you out of the room. And I've also got a practical experience. We built nearly 70 homes in Abuja, which we've sold. We did a survey. Over 99% of the people, and this is a green IFC advanced certification, less than 1% of the buyers mentioned the green characteristics as a reason for purchase. So it tells you that there's still a lot of work to be done to prepare the consumer, to educate the consumer, to make sure that they see it as there's an economic interest for them. And a lot of the European markets, I don't know, and to some extent US as well, a lot of the successful markets have provided economic incentives for consumers. That would be extremely difficult to do in Africa because there's not a lot of money to go around. But when we're having these discussions, we need to understand that the markets that some of our experts are coming from actually have invested, and even with those incentives, politically, there's still a challenge. There's currently, at least from the UK where I'm based, there's a strong opposition to the higher cost of green. And now you're now seeing a political backlash in terms of governments. So you've got the UK Labour Party that promised significant billions to be invested to support green. They've had to scale it down because the citizens are saying, I'm not prepared to pay extra for it. So these are so-called matured markets. So you can then imagine when we're trying to propose the same scenario in Africa without helping people and just expecting that you're going to get this consumer, people are just going to wake up one day and say, look, I love green. It ain't going to happen. So let's just wake up and smell the coffee. So the other point I think I need to mention is the point around, from our findings, we found modern methods of construction, there were inconsistent acceptability. So you look at the Nordic countries like Sweden and Denmark that has an history of the UK, Italy, there's less adoption of modern methods of construction. And actually we've seen the reverse. Significantly in the United Kingdom, most of the modern method construction firms have actually gone bankrupt because of lack of demand. So I find interesting when we talk about timber and all the other stuff, I think a lot of these things may make sense, and I think the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of this makes sense academically, it makes sense in terms of all the indicators we talk about. Well, if you don't fix user awareness and user adaptation or the cultural issues that comes from consumer education, investment in consumer awareness, we'll be surprised that we will raise the money, but then we start going back to what we've done before, chasing the pipeline. And that would be a shame because there's a significant level of interest coming from different sources in order to invest in things. I've got 2 minutes. I can feel it's there. The next slide, please. So, I think I've covered the implication in terms of lessons for Africa. I'm saying caution. I'm saying let's work out the baseline in terms of where we are, in terms of this journey towards green. And from that, you then develop your blueprint of, and do that in collaboration with the plan for investment, so that the ecosystem that Simon mentioned yesterday is being addressed, as well as the clamor for financial investment. If we've not fixed the housing ecosystem, then you be rest assured that the green housing ecosystem that are correlated will not be addressed as well. Next slide, please, which is the final slide. So this is the toolkit that we've now, the sort of structure of the toolkit, which in essence is saying we're working with the IFC to map countries or municipal areas in order to get a baseline position and then deploying a range of interventions, contextualized locally, but range of interventions, whether it's tax incentives, whether it's regulatory frameworks, whether it is planning or institutional development, and applying it to the gap analysis. And I think that's a key point. Each country, each municipal authority needs to start its own baseline assessment and then come up with a range of intervention. We'll plan that, in my view, in concert with the financial investment or potential investment fund, or else we'll be here in another 50 or 10 years' time, or how many years, still talking about the fact that, oh, we've got the money, but it's not planning on there. Thank you very much for your time.